A very warm welcome to One Slot, a program where we discuss African solutions to African problems. My name is Felicity Ezewuike. Starting today, October 17th, China is hosting about 130 leaders from Africa, South America, and other emerging markets to the Third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. The summit is to mark the 10th anniversary of its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Launched a decade ago, the BRI is a plan, a signature policy of President Xi Jinping that has seen Chinese companies build infrastructures, including ports, roads, and power plants around the world in a bid to boost trade and economic growth. But one decade in, some observers say the initiative may be losing steam as Beijing's domestic economy struggles to bounce back to pre-pandemic growth levels, as well as growing concerns about unsustainable debt recipient countries. A Reuters report quoting data from the American Enterprise Institute think tank says more than $90 billion worth of Chinese commercial investment in BRI project has faced insurmountable problems. A Time publication just less than 48 hours ago has the caption, as Xi Jinping celebrates 10 years of Belt and Road, the project of the century faces uncertain future. To discuss BRI and its future, particularly as it affects Africa, is Lauren Johnston, Associate Professor, University of Sydney, China Studies Center, Berlin. Thank you very much for giving us your time. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Felicity. It's great to join you.
BRI seeks international action to enhance cooperation, as they say, and promote infrastructure investment in nearly 70 countries across board, Asia, Africa, Europe, through land and maritime routes. What's your assessment of its 10-year journey?
I think it's a learning by doing journey. It's very much, and it began just after the GFC, when interest rates were very low and growth was stalling as a result of the kind of legacy of the GFC, and it front loaded quite a few large development projects in places like Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on. And then it got hit by the pandemic. So you had this amazing cessation of the world economy and of global supply chains. So, the capacity of countries to generate revenue and to utilize those investments was totally compromised by the pandemic. So I think it's a little hard to judge it because maybe 2 to 3 years, and the most recent years of that 10 were the COVID-19 pandemic. And, I see it as a long run. Just the way when Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the world in 1978-79, he launched what was called reform and opening. And it was a very fluid, very flexible, very trial by doing process of helping China to reform its economy and open up and catch up to the world. And I see, Belt and Road was launched right about when China became a net outbound foreign investor. And it had lots of US dollars in savings that were not earning a high rate of interest and so on. And it's the sort of outbound agenda for this period, which is the same as the inbound agenda for the opening and reform. So opening and reform, 1978 to 2012, you had China had all these cheap labor, cheap factory workers. It was a very young and not very well-off population. Now China is much richer, and it has different structural challenges, different opportunities to bring to the world. And it's really, this process will last for another few decades. So it's the kind of outbound version of the last 40 years inbound. And just like the first 10 years of opening and reform had ups and downs, indeed, Belt and Road also. And I just see it as a slow and steady journey across as China goes out into the world more.
All right. let's look at the theme for this year. There seemed to be a focus on cooperation. Let me say the high quality belt and road cooperation together for common development and prosperity. What's the idea behind the choice to focus more on cooperation? Might it be connected with maybe the pullback from the West, do you think?
For sure, that must be part of it. Actually, the Belt and Road, from its launch speeches by Xi in Kazakhstan and Indonesia in 2013, both speeches promoted cooperation, people-to-people ties, state-to-state peaceful relations. Certainly the Indonesia speech did. And so I guess it's now emphasizing those aspects of the Belt and Road in light of all that tension. Indeed, just this post-COVID, lots of different issues going on. The high quality development aspect reflects partly what's going on in China's economy. So China has entered a period whereby its working age population is now shrinking. And that you have a lot more retirees, and soon retirees, than in the past, based on this huge number of people born in the 50s and 60s who are now heading to retirement. And so China itself, in order to keep growing, now has to turn to its fewer younger workers who are more educated on average than their parents and their grandparents were. So they have to become high quality workers in order to be able to pay for all of China's pensioners, and in order that China can get from middle income to high income country. So partly this high quality development push is a mirror of what's going on in China, and therefore it's the mirror of what China wants to bring to the world in parallel. It's a kind of a mirror of where it's at domestically. So also will bring higher quality development along the Belt and Road.
Okay, let's look at what's on the ground now. The Chinese government released a white paper ahead of this event. That was last week. They're saying that the BRI will, among other things, but now focus more on issues like peace, climate change, energy crisis, and artificial intelligence. What can you tell us about this desire to be divergent, really?
I guess there's an increased push now on climate change just simply because it's becoming a more accepted and known issue around the world and a bigger priority. Also, China is, through the Belt and Road, it's trying to foster realization of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think come due in 2030. So there's like 6 years left to achieve them. So a big push now through the Belt and Road will help China to help other countries realize the Sustainable Development Goals, while also fostering, China's economy. China has, realizing many decades ago that China would never be a frontier economy in the combustion engine and so on, which is Germany and the States and perhaps Japan, China sort of leapt forward and invested a lot in green energy vehicles, in solar power, in hydropower. So it's really a world leader in those technologies, and the same in AI. So those are key industries and areas going forward. And China has invested in them for the last 20 years. So by promoting those energies through those sectors through the Belt and Road, China not only can help those other countries to develop AI and to leapfrog dirty energy, hopefully, into clean energy. Maybe it does that imperfectly, but that's like a win-win for China because it has such great and relatively forward and affordable, electronic vehicles. So I think China has a model now of BYD as a company based in Hunan in China, and it's one of the world's leaders in green energy vehicles. And they have, they've got a model that is like a kind of $1,000 or $2,000 car, a green energy car, an electric car. You can't buy a $2,000 Tesla, for example. So it's about China designing, affordable green technologies across the whole Belt and Road to foster its own companies while helping climate change and helping those countries to develop. So that's a real win-win.
A real win-win indeed. I mean, we've tried to see how the BRI is and what it's been able to do over the years. We're domiciled here in Africa, and of course, in conversations like this, while it's a win for them, Africa will also be looking for our win. So from what you've seen so far, how has Africa benefited from its participation in the Belt and Road Initiative? How is it, for instance, promoting economic integration and regional cooperation for the continent?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to generalize in the first instance. Obviously, there's a lot of different experiences, a lot of different sectors, and so on. I think the push in infrastructure may have helped to overcome some infrastructural barriers. Even in Dar es Salaam, a simple bridge across the main bay cuts transportation around the city, connects the two sides of the city that just, used to require a pretty slow boat. And the massive new, just going to Nigeria, the new port in Lekki, which is the first mega port in West Africa ever. It's just now emerging in terms of how it will be able to be used to generate the revenues. There are, of course, issues about who gets those revenues. Will those revenues benefit Nigerians en masse or just a few wealthy Nigerians? And Kenya has so far struggled to get as much value from its SGR train from Mombasa to Nairobi as had hoped. Obviously, COVID-19 was part of that. Another part of that was that the original plan connected that train line to neighboring countries like Uganda and so on. And the absence of that connecting train line to those countries diminishes the original cost effective and cost sustainability of the train. So I believe while Ruto's in Beijing for this summit, he's going to try to get the funding to connect those trains up. It's obviously still a very significant investment in terms of cost, and there needs to be a lot of exports around that. I guess that puts Ruto in a good position to say, well, we've had this COVID setback. We truly need to foster our exports to China. Like China, what and how can we look at what you're going to import from us, and what we can manufacture in Kenya to import, not just to other African countries, but really back to China too. So there does need to be a huge push on exports from Africa to China.
Okay, I actually have a specific question for that Mombasa-Nairobi railway that you mentioned, connecting Kenya's largest port to the capital. China actually says it's a success story for them, but it's tricky. On the one hand, we understand, let me see how I put it here, we'll work on the section of that railway which was meant to reach neighboring Uganda was and serve other landlocked country was pulled out, and Kenya opted to go, I'm trying to see how I put it here, opted to go with a Turkish firm. Now, we understand Kenya owes about $6 billion to China. That's the national data. Knowing this, is there not a contradiction with William Ruto expecting to go and explore funding options for the remaining section of the railway during the Belt and Road Summit?
It's definitely been an expensive investment overall. I've caught the train myself from both ways, in fact, to and from. And there are different aspects about its cost effectiveness. For example, the road that existed for most of the freight before required more fuel to be purchased overseas, which required more US dollars. And it had a much higher accident rate. So it was much less safe to be a citizen of Kenya or anywhere near the road than near the railway line. In terms of why would Ruto be wanting more when, there's so many other players, there's Turkey, there's perhaps even there's EU, Japan, America cooperation willing to invest in railway lines. I guess what Ruto might be trying to do is strengthen his hand with all of those players. If he can say to the Turkish constructor, well, we've been offered this deal by China, please offer us a better deal again, then he could just be fishing in order to increase his bargaining power across all those players more interested to invest in Kenya now. Whereas perhaps when China first built that Mombasa to Nairobi railway line, China was the only interested investor. So, to that extent, the Belt and Road has perhaps instigated a much more investor interested environment than existed before. And, to what extent China in different areas in different ways offers the best deal in that environment, that depends what China offers. But that itself is partly potentially a product of that very first train line. So if I was a Kenyan looking, maybe you'd be super happy that now Turkey will build this and whoever else will build that. At the same time, you would know that it was the first train built by China that instigated that competition. So one hopes that Ruto is maximizing all of Kenya's options so that those big projects that are required can be made as competitively and cost effectively as possible, whether that's by China or another country.
All right, in our conversation so far, two names have popped up, Nigeria and Kenya. But in a general view, what do you think will be some of the wish list for Africa that they will be presenting at the BRI? We know that leaders from Nigeria, for instance, the vice president is there and he's looking to woo more investors over to the country. But if you were starting on a vantage point, what would be the highlight for you for Africa?
Wow. I guess I would, there's the background issue of the debt sustainability of some of these big infrastructure projects. The best way to address that debt depends on so many different factors. So I don't have a view over whether it would be good or not that China would offer some debt relief around some of those early investments. With that aside, or at least that acknowledged, I would say it would be great if African countries could come away with some more labor intensive and industrial, like China has just, a Chinese firm has just, I can't remember the name, but it's a medical kind of basic, medical technologies manufacturing firm. And it will open a plant to make some sort of manufactured medical equipment in Kenya for sale in different African countries. So tapping into the kind of, African continental free trade area. So you make there, and then obviously it makes more sense to export within the region when you have these trade benefits than to import from outside of the region. So I guess it would be great to see more of those type of plants being announced, plants that create good jobs, sustainable jobs. And to some extent, there may also be import substituting. Now, I don't mean that African countries should aim for this kind of 1960s, socialist 70s import substitution agenda. If it is a sustainable and affordable investment, and then it does make sense in light of this free trade area, then definitely to encourage more industrial plants and, perhaps different training opportunities of young Africans in order that they can be employable, in their own country very easily, and so to foster this preparation. And then agriculture, development of agriculture too. But I think a big win would be industrial plants where they work.
I want to take you back to something you mentioned, and it triggered a thought about, the concern in Africa about how much we owe to China. That's one of the biggest problems. Some people even say Chinese also realize that some of these countries, they carry an awful lot of debt, and they may struggle to really pay back. What's your thinking on the level of debt that Africa seems to be engaging in and the ability to pay back? How also, now we're hearing that China maybe may review some more debt, maybe relief or more loans. How are they responding? What is your thinking generally on this subject of debt in Africa?
I think I actually spent a year working in the Ministry of Planning and Development of Sierra Leone some years ago, and another year in the Ministry of Finance of Guyana in the Caribbean, including in their debt management division. So I've experienced this process of debt relief and this process of lending for infrastructure and so on firsthand in at least these two countries. I think it's an incredibly complex environment because there's so many issues at play. Like sometimes governments who do the borrowing can be irresponsible, and it's very difficult to work out the best response to that, and also how predatory lenders have been where a country is perhaps not being governed perfectly. So how then you find this equilibrium into that dynamic is very, very difficult. In terms of what China can, traditionally China tends not to offer debt relief. I think it sees this as a sort of a Western cycle of lending and relief, and they would rather extend the repayment period or extend the grace period and so on. So I guess I would encourage, worst case scenario, it would make sense that most of these loans have the years of the COVID period added on to the grace period or added on to, like the no interest rate or low interest rate period. It would really make sense to take that COVID period and just add it on again because it was such an outlier, and perhaps China can afford relatively to be generous there. I wouldn't make any generalizations for Africa and debt in general because I think every country is just so different and it's such a complex situation. They have different issues in terms of who and what and so on. So
yeah,
I guess I would encourage China most of all to just take that period of COVID and sort of block it out almost and take it.
And they also have a country. It's supposed to be a win-win. They also have a country to run and economy to grow as well. So,
sure. And these lending organizations are very They're not all profit driven, but they're quite profit driven. They have their own interests, if they don't get that money back, then they can't do whatever else they do. So indeed, it's just such a complex matrix, and there probably hasn't been that much cooperation even between Chinese lenders. So the case of Zambia in particular, Zambia has like many different Chinese entities that lent to many different Zambian organizations. So such a matrix, just crazy.
It is. Even from the explanations you're giving, I'm like trying to wrap my head around the magnitude of it. But I'm told we have less than 3 minutes, so I'd just like us to wrap up by looking at what role does Africa play in shaping the future direction and expansion of BRI, because it's not just Africa. There are other continents in that place as well.
When she was in Johannesburg in August for the BRICS summit, he hosted a parallel China-Africa leaders dialogue. So not all African leaders were there. It wasn't the Forum on China-Africa equivalent, but there was a number of African leaders there. And she launched 3 different plans for Africa. One was agriculture, one was industrialization, and one was talent education development. And they're quite linked to some of the development gaps, which he'd previously spoken about as China's perception of Africa's biggest kind of development hurdles. So he has these 3 plans: agriculture, industrialization, talent development, training for all these young, people wanting a nice career. And into that, there's another quite interesting agenda in Hunan province in China, which is one of China's ancient food bowls and the home of Mao. And so China has two Africa-specific platforms from there. One is a trade expo, and the other is a kind of economic policy experiment zone. So if I was Africa, at least through the AU or through the different regional agencies, ECOWAS, SADC, and you know, the East African Community and so on, I would really develop a sub-regional plan for how to grab that Hunan plan and define it in your own name. Like, how do you want the agriculture plan to evolve? What sort of talent development? What are the problems so far? And if not at the country level, I would definitely empower those secretariats to do the sub-regional ones. That would be how I would shape it if I was in African shoes.
So much to talk about. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Lauren Johnston, for speaking with us. We appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Thanks for having me, Felicity.
Well, I'm going to short break now. When we come back, we'll be talking agriculture, business, and everything in between. Stay with us.